On April 17, 1960, during his performance at Bristol Hippodrome, Eddie Cochran was at the pinnacle of his career. With hits like Summertime Blues and 20 Flight Rocks, he became known as the James Dean of rock and roll among his fans. Amidst his rise, however, Eddie had some eerie premonitions, and soon the tragedy would struck, robbing the music world from one of its finest talents. But how did Eddie become a pioneer of rock and roll? And what did he foresee about his tragedy? Join us as we cover the life of Eddie Cochran, from his rise to fame to the tragic moments of that fateful night. Eddie Cochran was born as Ray Edward Cochran on October 3, 1938 in Albert Lea, Minnesota. He grew up as the youngest of 5 children, where he developed a deep love for music by constantly listening to the radio. And his musical interest grew even further when he got his hand on a K acoustic guitar, which his brother had left behind before leaving for his military training. At the age of 11, his dad made a pivotal decision to move to California with Eddie's brother, who had settled there after his military service. In 1951, while studying at the Bell Garden Junior High, 12-year-old Eddie got his hand on a guitar chord book in the school library, which he didn't understand at that time. Luckily, his brother recognized his passion for music and taught him some basic chords on the same old K guitar. This experience led him to perform in his school talent shows as well as in some local venues on a regular basis. In 1953, while performing in a local hall, he met Hank Cochran, who was a vocalist with the same name and passion for country music. Together, they started calling themselves the Cochran Brothers and took part in local events to grow their popularity. Their talent was clear from the start, where they soon landed a deal with Echo Records in 1955. And in the following year, they recorded their first singles, Two Blue Singing Stars and Your Tomorrow Never Comes. Soon after, Eddie made a life-changing decision when he left his school and put everything he had into music. With Hank by his side, they hit the road and began touring across the country. And it was during this tour, in Dallas, Eddie found himself in the crowd of a young singer named Elvis Presley, who was becoming quite the sensation at that time. This experience had a deep impact on Eddie, and he quickly decided to switch from traditional country to rock and roll. Up until this point, Eddie had some money saved up, thanks to the small success he had from their debut singles. To pursue rock and roll, he decided to change his guitar and opted for a Gretsch Orange 1920, which he modified further to get that jazzy sound. In 1956, while picking up a pack of strings for his new guitar at the Bell Garden Music Center, he met Jerry Cahart, who would later become his manager and co-writer. This encounter helped the duo in many ways, as Jerry was looking for someone who would sing his songs, and not long after, Cochran Brothers recorded a few songs with him. However, Hank would not be staying with Eddie forever, as he started having second thoughts about their career. And the duo finally decided to split up, when Eddie refused going back to country music. Not caring about the setback, Eddie kept working with Jerry, and just a few months later, their hard work paid off, when Eddie's solo single, Skinny Jim, ended up becoming a massive hit. Not stopping there, he starred in a low-budget music movie called The Girl Can't Help It, where he played 20 Flight Rock, a song which would later be labeled as one of the most iconic songs in rock and roll history. Funny thing was, the filmmaker, Boris Petrov, who offered him the role, said that Eddie had strong resemblance to the famous actor James Dean, which was also one of the reasons Boris cast him for a small role. In 1957, Eddie achieved a significant milestone when he signed a deal with Liberty Records and dropped an album, Singin' to My Baby, which would change rock and roll forever. And soon after the success of his album, Eddie started touring in the US and even went to Australia. Rumor has it that during this tour, Eddie became friends with some of the big names in rock and roll, like Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and Gene Vincent. In 1958, Eddie achieved chart-breaking success when he dropped hits like Summertime Blue and Come On Everybody, which turned him into a rising star worldwide, particularly in the UK, where his fans started calling him by the nickname James Dean of rock and roll. And it was during this time he was thinking of joining his friends, Buddy and Ritchie, on the Winter Dance Party tour. However, Buddy asked him to not come with them for some unknown reason, which one would say might have saved his life. And just a few months later, on February 3rd, 1959, when he heard the news of Buddy and Ritchie dying in the plane crash, he started having premonitions of his own death. His close friend and coworker both recalled Eddie making comments that he'd soon die in a tragic car crash. In fact, these things affected Eddie so much that he stopped doing tours and stayed home close to his family. However, looking at the financial burdens he had on his head, he had no other choice but to go on a tour, which would end up becoming his last. On 10th January 1960, Eddie arrived in the UK for a tour which would end up changing the rock and roll history forever. It was a long tour with a punishing schedule, where Eddie reportedly had to extend it further 10 weeks because of the overwhelming demand for tickets. And it was during this tour, when Eddie was performing at Liverpool, George Harrison, who would later be part of the Beatles, got an opportunity to play as a support act. He later said in the interview that Eddie looked like the true embodiment of rock and roll when he stood at the microphone, casually running his hands through his hair. However, the UK winter could be brutal for someone like Eddie, who grew up in the California air. And according to some rumors, he often had a cold during the entire tour. Just a week later, on that fateful night of April 17th, after his final show at Bristol Hippodrome, Eddie returned to the Royal Hotel at around 11 p.m. However, just as he felt a sense of relief after his grueling tour, he realized that he was getting late for their flight back to the US. Eddie quickly checked the time, where it was 11:15 p.m., and he was supposed to catch the flight at 2 a.m. that night from Heathrow Airport. The distance from Royal Hotel to airport was around 100 miles, and since they didn't have any other transportation available at such a late time, their tour manager decided to book a taxi. Eddie, along with his fellow performing artist, Vincent, and his fiancée Sharon Sheely, got in the cream-colored 1960 model of the Ford Consul Mark II saloon. The strange part was, just seconds before sitting in the taxi, Eddie had some eerie premonition where he told Sharon that something awful was about to happen, and fate would not let them be together. George Martin, their driver that night, chose the old A4 road, which goes through the town of Bath, while Eddie sat at the rear seat with Jean and Sharon. During that time, A4 was notorious for being bad at night with its sharp turns and rough patches. So the driver decided to take the shortcut through Chippenham, where he got confused and accidentally took a wrong turn. The tour guide, who was seated next to the driver, pointed out about the turn, and the driver immediately applied brakes. He turned back and increased the speed, trying to get back the right route through the road covered in darkness. Even though the weather that night was clear, the road had little to none streetlights, which made the driver unable to see the road ahead. In that split second, when the vehicle was traveling at around 60 miles per hour, the driver lost control and collided with something which seemed like a concrete pole. The impact was so intense that it forced open the rear left door, throwing Eddie and other passengers out on the road. Fortunately, when the vehicle came to a halt, their tour guide and driver walked out of the wreckage with minor injuries, where they saw Eddie, Sharon, and Jean lying on the grass verge. Jean had suffered from the broken collarbone, but he seemed out of danger. And on the other hand, Sharon had some bruises on her back and thighs. Things took an unexpected turn when they realized that Eddie was unresponsive. The locals who were at their home that night quickly came to the crash site upon hearing the large noise. They quickly called the authorities, and the three of them were immediately taken to the nearby St. Martin's Hospital, where they learned that Eddie suffered a major brain injury. The doctors on board tried their best to rescue him, but even after going through multiple surgeries, Eddie never woke up. And just like that, at around 4:10 p.m. the next day, he was officially announced dead at the age of 21. The investigation which followed after painted an even more confusing picture, where no mechanical failure was found in the car. The car had been going at about 60 miles an hour on a dark road that was supposed to be capped at 40. On top of that, the driver confessed his mistake of not seeing things properly that time, as he was in a hurry to get them to the airport. He was charged with speeding and dangerous driving, where he paid the fine of $70, which would be around $700 today, and he was sentenced to 5 months in prison with his license suspended for 15 years. In the coming days, on April 23rd, Jean and Sharon flew back to the US with Eddie's body, where just a couple of days after everyone gathered at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California, for Eddie's funeral. Just a few months later, Eddie's final song, 3 Steps to Heaven, was released, which, according to the reports, soared straight to #1 in the United Kingdom. However, as the years passed, many people around the world forgot about Eddie and how much he gave to rock and roll. There was no doubt that he was the pioneer of rock and roll, and this further highlighted when his fans around the world decided to put memorials at the crash site and at the hospital where it all ended. Today, his name might sit just behind giants like Elvis or the Beatles, but anyone who listened to him knows that he wasn't just part of rock and roll history, he was the rock and roll himself. So next time, when you find yourself in the UK or near the town of Bath, take out some time and visit his memorial, and remember the young man who burned so bright that he lit the path for everyone who came after. If you like this story and want to see more like this, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Also, press that bell icon so you won't miss future uploads from us. That's all for today, and we will see you in the next video.